Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Can the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, reinvent the international system? Can they collectively challenge the hegemony of Western-dominated trade and finance? Or do they merely want a greater say in how the world is run, and for whom? To CrossTalk the BRICS, I'm joined by Yaroslav Lissovolik here in Moscow. He is the chief economist at Deutsche Bank Russia. In Washington, we have Brian Becker. He is the national coordinator for the Answer Coalition. And in New York, we cross to Ann Lee. She is an adjunct professor at New York University and the author of the book, What the U.S. Can Learn from China. CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Yaroslav, if I go to you first, do the BRICS want to take on the West? Is that kind of relationship they have?
Well, I think not necessarily, but in some respects it seems as if this is the trend in terms of the recent policy measures that we're seeing from the BRICS. One of the measures is to combine the foreign exchange reserves of the countries and form a reserve that potentially could be used to deal with the crises in the world economy. And to some degree, you could look at this effort as a way to create a competitor to the International Monetary Fund. And then the other potential effort that is now undertaken by the BRICS countries is to create a development bank that would, much like the World Bank, would provide resources for developing countries to foster growth, to deal with social issues, etc. So in some respects, we're seeing that the BRICS are starting to create their own institutions that potentially can rival, can compete with the Bretton Woods institutions.
Brian, would you agree or disagree with what we just heard? Go ahead.
Well, I agree with it in part. I think that this is the beginning stage, really, of a process since the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc nations that actually, contributed to a rival power, a global power that allowed other countries, especially smaller and independent countries, to have an alternative to the West. Those countries, of course, would like BRICS to become a major part of the world scene because they want an alternative. They don't want to be just have the economic and military policies of the West shoved down their throat. But again, these countries don't have an anchor right now, as the socialist bloc did when it had the Soviet Union, which would allow it to have a completely independent and separate and many times conflictuous policy with the West. I think that the development of a development bank and the possibility of integration in terms of currency does allow for the potential to rival the dollar, but not anytime soon.
Okay, and how do you weigh in on this? Is this an alternative to the West and Western institutions?
I think that they are trying to create more leverage for themselves, because what really brings them together is the fact that they all are upset that they haven't been treated as fairly amongst the Western groups. So at the IMF and some other places where they want more representation because they have more economic heft to bring to the table, they're not given the seats that they're requesting. And so there's tension there where they feel like they're not being respected. And so that is in part one of the reasons why they want to come together, so they can actually have more bargaining power with the West. I don't necessarily think they're ready to challenge the West because they're not strong enough to take on the United States, for instance, who is, far and away the largest superpower. And so I think that they realize that these efforts to put together alternative institutions is just a way to see how they can cooperate with each other, how to work with each other. And they haven't historically, so this is a very new thing.
Yaroslav, it was mentioned earlier, this is not an ideological group like the socialist bloc before. What is its anchor then?
I think that's a very interesting question. I think it is really the idea, at least initially, I think it was the idea of an alternative, of a divergence in the economic development of the world economy. Essentially, the view from a lot of the participants in BRICS was that, say, in the 1990s, the trajectory of the world economy was that of convergence and the lack of alternatives. So for a lot of the participants in this group, this is a way to generate these alternatives and to generate dynamism into world economic development through developing these alternatives. I think another side to what we're seeing now is that the BRICS is a transcontinental alliance. Yeah. And that's a very new development in terms of, say, things like economic integration. I think the BRICS itself is starting to create a challenge in such a way that is starting to generate a response from the developed countries. For example, we're starting to hear from the US, from the European Union, that they want to intensify their transatlantic alliance and to create a free trade area. To some degree, it may be a response to what they're seeing with the BRICS. The same thing with the recent declarations by the EU and Japan that they would like to intensify economic interaction and create a free trade area. Again, this may be a response to the rise of the power of the BRICS. The BRICS in that regard, I think, is starting to impress a lot of the observers across the globe. And to some degree, this is also a new kind of architecture to the world's economy. It's an architecture whereby each of the countries that are members of the BRICS represent a certain continent. And to some degree, this is, a globalization. This is a world economy that is based on many columns, on many supporting pillars. That, I think, is something that renders the global economy and global economic development more sustainable.
Okay, Brian, I mean, maybe said differently, the West has screwed up the global economy, and the BRIC countries want to stay away from it.
Well, right, but they really can't. I mean, when you look at China's economic policy and its foreign policy, there's still, their whole orientation is towards integration into the world economy, and the world economy is dominated by the Western powers, by the United States in particular. The same goes with India. Of course, they want to have some sort of buffer so that they, too, are not simply dictated to by the United States and the Western powers. They, for the most part, represent the plundered as opposed to the plundering part of the planet, those who were basically colonized. That was true with China and India, Brazil, South Africa. In the case of Russia, it sort of left the imperial world and joined the other world after 1917. They want to have an alternative, and they want to have a buffer. But again, I think the big problem will be as they integrate into the world economy, the U.S. has certain rules that it demands and certain political concessions. And you can see by the way they handled the Syria appeal that they were very modest and modulated in their response. In the Soviet era, the Soviet bloc would have sent a strong message, hands off Syria. They would have been sort of signifying to the West that this would possibly lead to a global confrontation, as they did during the 1973 war, the Middle East war. So you can see that each of the countries still wants to maintain a friendly relationship with the West, but they want a buffer or a shield from the West's kind of hegemonic desires and designs against all of the world, including against them.
And weigh in on that. I think it's very interesting. They want more respect, essentially, and want a greater say.
Yes, I agree with that. And that's what I was saying before, that they really just want more bargaining power, more leverage, so that they are respected, that they are given a chance to continue to grow their markets and not be hampered by the West. And I think that this is going to be, an interesting evolvement of how the BRICS can actually become more of a political bloc that way, because they themselves had been historically enemies in many respects and have differences today still. And so for them to try to overcome their differences in order to try to unite will be interesting. if they are able to do that the way that the United States was able to unite with Western Europe and create a NATO bloc after World War II, that would be interesting. I don't know if they're capable of that anytime soon.
Well, let me ask you a question, Ann. Let me ask you a question here.
That would make the BRICS.
Let's look at the crisis, the crisis in Cyprus. I mean, could you see one day where a country like Cyprus would go to the BRICS for a loan and not the IMF?
Oh, it's definitely possible.
Yes, I think what we can...
Today, China sort of functions like the IMF in many respects anyway, or like a World Bank, where they have been providing hundreds of millions, billions of loans to African countries and then forgave them when they weren't able to pay them back. And so creating one that's a BRIC bank enables China to basically say, okay, we don't want to stick out. We've got friends who also are on our side, and so that this way they feel like they're more international, more integrated.
Brian, you wanted to jump in there. Go ahead.
Yeah. I think again, we're at the beginning stage of the BRICS process. The world desires an alternative to the sort of complete domination by NATO powers, led by and anchored by the United States. The world hasn't had that since the dissolution of the socialist bloc. Of course, it'll emerge now, if it can, on a different basis. The economic power of the United States is dissipating, but its military power is being used as a substitute. In other words, to maintain domination, to enforce U.S. interests. But you can see the dynamic development of Brazil's economy, India's economy, and China's economy, and Russia's economy. All of those countries
Brian,
together.
I have to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the BRICS. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the BRICS. All right, Yaroslav, one thing all these countries in the BRICS are interested in is getting away from the U.S. dollar. Is that possible?
Yes, I think it's possible. We're seeing that these attempts have already been undertaken with varying degree of success, but certainly a significant part of the bilateral or mutual trade between these countries is targeted to be conducted in the currencies of these countries. And the same to some degree potentially with mutual investment flows. So this is something that I think is very much in line with the needs and the cravings of the world economy, because there is a high demand today for alternative reserve currencies, because the U.S. has economic problems. The EU has significant economic problems right now. So the role of these reserve currencies, the dollar and the euro, is undermined by these developments. And a lot of the central banks in the world are looking for alternatives, and the BRICS certainly can offer this alternative. What is needed is to intensify the world trade, the global trade, with the flows denominated in these currencies. The same with regard to investment. And then I think potentially we will see in the coming years that there will be more reserve currencies emerging, including from the BRICS.
Okay, Brian, weigh in there. I mean, ending dollar supremacy.
Yeah, I think that, of course, the dollar supremacy is a form of tyranny. The United States gets to print the world currency. I mean, that's a great advantage and gives them tremendous leverage. And it unequalizes everything to the advantage of the United States. I think what was most noteworthy, or one of the most noteworthy things about this BRICS summit, was the trade agreement between Brazil and China, which was based on binational usage of their own currencies and bypassing the dollar in terms of trade arrangements. Others will start to do that too. This again will be a longer process, but you can certainly see that these countries want to do it. They're seeking to do it, and the rest of the world would hope that they succeed as they do it.
Ann, go ahead. The end of the dollar world.
I don't see that happening in our lifetimes unless something happened to the U.S. military, because the dollar supremacy is really based on the fact that oil has to be traded in dollars. And as long as that's the case, and the world still is most dependent on oil for energy, and the U.S. knows this, and this is how they can keep their dominance, how they can maintain control, and that's why the Middle East is an important part of the world for U.S. national interests. And so as long as people need oil for energy needs, they will always need to have the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency. And since there is no other military able to challenge the U.S. at any point in the near future, I just don't see that going away.
Yaroslav, we're talking about.
Peter,
go ahead, jump in. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think Anna's fundamentally right about the U.S. military primacy being the central factor in this equation. But let's not forget, we saw regional integration with ALBA, led by Chavez in Venezuela, starting to reorganize the way Latin America relates to itself. Of course, Venezuela there was an anchor, and Venezuela is a large oil producer. So too is Russia. I think we can. This has to be seen not as basically a deterministic effect of oil, but what the political will is and the capability of the different players. The resources are there. It's a question of whether they can unite together and set up a real, identifiable political and military and economic pole in contrast to the West.
I think,
go ahead, jump in.
Just on this point, I think it's also important for the BRICS countries to change some of their economic policies to render the emergence of alternative reserve currencies more possible. And in particular, I would cite the case of China. And certainly it would be easier for a lot of the countries to have Chinese currency as one of their reserve currencies, but there are capital controls and there are currency restrictions in China. So to some degree, it's also a function of the policies of these countries. And if they do follow the route of more open economies, of lower barriers on capital controls, currency operations, then this will be, again, a contribution to rendering these currencies reserve currencies of the world.
So we're focused on what unites these countries, but a lot of things, there's a lot of differences among them as well. Let's be honest here. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think absolutely. In terms of the challenges facing these countries, there are similarities, in particular modernization needs, the need to develop infrastructure, but at the same time, there are significant differences as well. One of the differences, say, between Russia and a lot of the other economies like China is the dependency on oil and the susceptibility to swings in oil prices. Another dimension is demographics. Russia is in a bit of a different cycle in that regard. Then you look at per capita GDP, Russia is actually the highest of the members there, and other countries like China, like India, have significant scope for catch-up, and there is a significant variation there in terms of that indicator. So there are these differences, as was mentioned before. There are political differences as well on some of the issues, and we've seen these differences in the past that were quite significant as well. But I think this drive to modernization, this drive to catch up with the West is something that is going to unite a lot of the interests of these countries to overcome some of the lingering political differences that may be out there.
Brian, what do you think about that different path to modernization?
Well, let's go back and put this into the history of the past half century, too. I mean, when China and the Soviet Union formed an alliance in 1950 following the successful triumph of the Chinese Revolution, that meant 2/5 of the world's people were in an alliance that had a different path towards economic development. What allowed them to integrate was that they had planned economies. They had the communist parties as ruling parties. I think that all of the countries everywhere want modernization and they want to develop. The question is, can they really fully develop economically without taking into the political and military risks that exist with the domination of the Western world? And that still is a big problem, especially for China, I think.
And a lot of people say this is China's group. It heads the group. What do you say to that?
I would say that there is some truth to that because they are the dominant. They are the dominant economic power in the BRICS. They've driven most of the growth amongst the group there, and I think China basically doesn't want to stick out and be the only one drawing all the attention from the United States, and therefore is using BRICS as its anchor. And I also think that, with this new Asia pivot that was announced recently in China's belief to contain them, the BRICS would then, because it's a global situation, because it touches all ends of the earth, that this would then act as an alternative, as an encirclement of the United States in a way, because it is global. And so I think that is an interesting dynamic that, we should watch closely.
Brian, you wanted to jump in there? Go ahead.
Yes, I think that's right. China will not be the official anchor of BRICS the way the Soviet Union really was the official anchor of the Warsaw Pact and Comecon. It is the dominant economic force. China has a problem, and I agree with Ann. The Asia pivot means that a greater and greater part of the U.S. Navy is along China's shores. The Korean Peninsula is a tinderbox because, of course, in the West they say it's because of North Korean provocations, but the U.S. and South Korea is really provoking the situation with endless war games. China's in a very precarious position as the United States also cements its military relationship with Japan. So BRICS will be seen by China as another avenue, as an alternative, possibly as a shield against sort of a unilateral focus by the United States against its own development.
Yaroslav, do you think more countries will join this group?
I think potentially we will see more countries joining this group. I think for the time being, the BRICS will probably take a pause and will try to structure and crystallize the process of integration in the next several years. But then potentially, yes, we will probably see such candidates as Indonesia or Turkey, a country essentially from a Muslim world entering this organization and again rendering it even more diverse, even more representative of the essentially of the face of the earth, of the developing world. And I think this is something that is already discussed in various centers and forums around BRICS. And yeah, I think within the next 3 to 5 years, we will see another member of the organization.
Well, Brian, don't you think that will kind of dilute their power? More and more members?
Well, and it also depends on whether the members have any, what their relationship is with the West. Take Turkey, for example. Turkey is the eastern flank of NATO and functioning really as an extension in some ways of the NATO powers' military plans for the destruction of the Syrian government. Of course, you could never have NATO powers in with BRICS and then somehow pretend BRICS is going to be an alternative to Western powers. I mean, you can't separate the economic policies from the military policies because the military policies are, I think, as Ann said, really the dominating force of world politics right now.
Okay, we've run out of time. Fascinating discussion. Many thanks today to my guests in Moscow, Washington, and in New York. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.
I love you.